Is the God of the Bible a just God? Like you, I was always told that God was a God that never practiced injustice. And of course, we have good reason to believe this to be the case. Deuteronomy 32:4 says, "He is the rock, his works are perfect, and all of his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright, and just is he." And we even see in the prophet, Zephaniah 3:5, "The Lord within her is righteous. He does no wrong. Morning by morning he dispenses his justice, and every new day he does not fail, yet the unrighteous know no shame." But if God in fact was righteous or unrighteous, how could we know? I think the only way to answer the question is to actually define what we mean by righteousness. And there's a good Christian definition from The Gospel for Real Life by Jerry Bridges. And he says, justice may be defined as rendering to everybody according to one's due. Justice means we get exactly what we deserve. And obviously, injustice would be the opposite of that. People getting what they didn't deserve. For example, if I committed a crime, but somebody else had to pay the penalty for it, that's what we would consider injustice. So, can we actually look at the Bible, examine the God, and ask ourselves, is this God perfectly just in all of his ways when we actually examine the behaviors of the God rather than just analyzing what people are saying about the God? And that's why I've got seven very important passages I want to cover here today. There are at least seven occasions which God practices injustice. There are actually a lot more than seven, but I didn't want to make the video too long. So here are seven of my favorites. And some of you are already getting the idea that I'm going to talk about some of the common stuff like Noah's flood or the cursing from Adam and Eve's sin, but I've actually chosen not to cover some of those common ones. I'm going to try to cover seven different occasions where God practices injustice. And these are stories that most people aren't very familiar with. And I think you're going to find them to be very interesting. So, passage number one is going to be 2 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 14. And this story is typically referred to as the Avenging of the Gibeonites. Now, in 2 Samuel 21, we're told immediately that there was a famine in the days of King David. It says, "Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years. Year after year, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said, 'There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he has put the Gibeonites to death.'" Now, this might make you wonder what's happening here with the Gibeonites, because they're not Israelites. Why does God care if they're being put to death? Well, if you go back to the book of Joshua during the conquest narrative, the Gibeonites give a little bit of aid to the Israelites as they're coming into the land. In Joshua 9, verse 18, it says, "The Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders, but all the leaders said to all the congregation, 'We have sworn by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we must not touch them.'" So there was an agreement really early on that they swore by the Lord, and you can't break a swear to the Lord. They swore that they would allow the Gibeonites to live in the land, but Saul went back on that. That's why we read in 2 Samuel 21 that there's blood guilt on Saul's hand, because Saul was the one who broke the bond with the Lord, the covenant that was made with the Gibeonites. It says, "So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had tried to wipe them out in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, 'What shall I do for you? How shall I make expiation that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?' The Gibeonites said to him, 'It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house. Neither is it for us to put anyone in Israel to death.' He said, 'What do you say that I should do for you?' They said to the king, 'The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord.' And the king says, 'I will hand them over.' So the Gibeonites say, 'To settle the blood feud with Saul, we need you to give 7 members of Saul's household to us. And then before your Lord, before Yahweh, we will impale them. And this is the retribution that we seek.'" Now, you might ask yourself, this sounds kind of crazy. I don't see how this has anything to do with Yahweh just yet. Well, it gets really interesting in the next 2 verses we're going to read. Go to 2 Samuel 21:9. he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they impaled them on the mountain before the Lord. The 7 of them impaled together. They were put to death on the first days of the harvest at the beginning of the barley harvest. So this is interesting because remember, there's a famine, and God sent the famine because there's blood guilt in the land and it needs to be dealt with. And then if you go down to verse 14, we get the conclusion. It says, they did all that the king commanded. After that, God heeded the supplications for the land. So it wasn't until they actually executed these 7 random members of Saul's household that God was like, okay, the blood guilt, it can be cleared. So not only is God okay with blood vengeance, as if that's like a thing, but it's also true that he's willing to harm his own people because of it. Because remember, famine harms the people indiscriminately. So if there's a famine in the land, it's going to affect everybody. There were probably women and children that died of starvation that had nothing to do with Saul's decisions. So it's just really weird that God is totally willing not only to punish 7 members of Saul's household that probably didn't have anything to do with the killings, and they get executed. And then on top of it, as a warning, 3 years of famine, making everybody in the land suffer. It's just this really weird instance where God is perfectly okay punishing a whole bunch of people unrelated to the crime in order for the crime to have some sort of vengeance before God is done with his bloodthirst. Now, you might be thinking that the Gibeonite avenging was pretty horrific, but 2 Samuel chapter 24 has now entered the chat. This is the chapter where David is punished for taking a census, for numbering the people of Israel. It's not entirely clear how that is a sin. We just know that it clearly seems to be a sin. And David recognizes that it is a sin, but what God does about David's sin is the problem. So let's read starting in verse 10. David was stricken to the heart because he had numbered the people of Israel. David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, I pray, you take away the guilt of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. So David, interestingly enough, is admitting his own guilt for what has happened, right? But that's not good enough for God. So God is going to send the prophet Gad to offer a series of punishments, 3 different punishments that David has to pick from. Unfortunately, all 3 of the punishments are horrific and they address more than just King David. For example, starting in verse 13, it says, Gad came to David and told him, and he asked him, shall 7 years of famine come on you, on your land, or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you, or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? So now he has to pick between one of these 3 punishments, and all 3 of them actually fall on the people of Israel, not on David. And now listen to what happens, starting in verse 14. Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into human hands. So David doesn't even really suggest what the punishment should be. He just said, let the Lord decide. I will throw myself on the mercy of the Lord. But let's see what God actually does. Verse 15. So the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel from that morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 of the people died from Dan to Beersheba. But when the angel stretched out his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented concerning the evil and said to the angel who was bringing destruction on the people, it is enough. Now stay your hand. So not only does the Bible itself refer to this as evil, but it's also true that it's happening to a random allotment of the people. 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba, that's from the northern territory to the southern territory, are being executed by the angel of the Lord through the pestilence. Verse 17 says, when David saw the angel who was destroying the people, he said to the Lord, I alone have sinned, and I, the shepherd, have done evil. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, be against me and against my father's house. So again, David recognizes that he's the only one who sinned here, yet it is the people of Israel that are getting tortured and punished by this pestilence. And David cries out to the Lord to let this not be the case. So you have to ask yourself, if God is a God of justice, why is he okay punishing the innocent for a sin that they did not commit? David himself is pointing out the injustice here. I alone have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done evil, but these sheep, what have they done? They haven't done anything. But God is totally okay, again, with punishing the innocent to make a point to the guilty. And now that we are talking about King David, there's another instance that we simply must talk about. 2 Samuel chapter 12. Now, this is an incident that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but may not be completely familiar with all the details. If I asked you about the episode of Bathsheba, you might be able to recite to me, yes, that's when he took another man's wife. He had Uriah the Hittite executed in battle, and then God punished him by having the son that was born to them executed. And that is true. That is one punishment that happened. But there's actually another punishment that was part of this that a lot of people don't catch. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 12. We'll start in verse 11. Says, "Thus saith the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in broad daylight. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel in broad daylight." So God is saying, listen, I am going to have trouble caused in your household, so much so that your wives are taken from you and raped in broad daylight. And you might be asking yourself, well, is this an empty threat or a full threat? This was a full threat because it actually comes true if you go to 2 Samuel chapter 16. And while King David is on the run from his child goes into Jerusalem, is taking ownership over the palace and all of David's things, and he wants to give a display of force, signaling that he's now in charge and King David's no longer in charge. So he goes to Ahithophel, an advisor, and asks him, "What shall I do?" And we go to verse 20 in chapter 16. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your counsel. What shall we do?" Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, the ones that he left to look after the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself odious to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened." So they pitched a tent for Absalom upon the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. The counsel given by Ahithophel to rape the wives of David on top of the palace in front of all the people in broad daylight was successful. People took it as a show of power that he was now in charge. And you might be asking yourself, and this is what the apologists will say, well, how do we know that they were raped and they didn't go to it willingly? Well, we know that for sure because in Deuteronomy chapter 22, it clearly states that anybody who is going to commit adultery, which this would have been if they were willing, they get executed and it's not optional. It says you must purge the evil from within Israel. So they didn't commit adultery because they would have been executed afterwards. And we know that they weren't executed afterwards because in chapter 20 of the same book, 2 Samuel, it tells us what King David did to them. In verse 3, it says, David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 concubines who had left to look after the house and put them in a house under guard and provided for them, but he did not go into them. So they were shut up until the day of their death, living as if in widowhood, because now that they were defiled, according to Deuteronomy 24, they're not supposed to be sleeping with David. What you're not supposed to do is allow your wife to be defiled by another man and then go back to the husband and defile the husband. And that's why David took them back as wives, but he basically made them as living widows. The law of the Lord would have been execution, which he didn't do. So clearly, these are women that were raped, and they were treated as though they were rape victims. Now, you might be asking yourself why it's okay to punish the women for the sins of King David. And I know a lot of people are saying, well, King David did get punished because he had to endure his child dying and he had to endure his wives being raped. But remember, the wives were the ones that received the punishment. The wives did not do anything wrong. They were taken in broad daylight and they were violated on top of the palace. And this wasn't something that just Absalom did. Remember back in chapter 12, 2 Samuel says, Thus saith the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes. So this is not something that God is just saying, I'm going to allow happen. God says, I'm going to cause it to happen because this is not a God who cares about justice. Now, our next example is Deuteronomy 22, verses 13 to 21. And you might be thinking to yourself that the last story might be hard to top, but this might be my favorite on the list. And trust me, it is horrific. In Deuteronomy 22, 13 through 21, we have an actual law given by God to the Israelites. And it says, suppose a man marries a woman, but after going into her dislikes her and makes up charges against her, slandering her by saying, I married this woman, but when I lay with her, I did not find evidence of her virginity. The father of the young woman and her mother shall then submit the evidence of the young woman's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. The father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. And now he has made up charges against her, saying, I did not find evidence of your daughter's virginity. But here's the evidence of my daughter's virginity. Then they shall spread out the cloth before the elders of the town. The elders of that town shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, which they shall give to the young woman's father, because he has slandered a virgin of Israel. She shall remain his wife. He shall not be permitted to divorce her as long as he lives. So we'll recap so far. If a woman does not bleed on her wedding night, so it says, suppose a man marries a woman, but after going into her dislikes her. If she doesn't bleed on her wedding night, then they have to take her to the elders at the city gate. And it's up to the parents to provide the evidence of the virginity. And the evidence of the virginity is in verse 17. It says, they will spread out the cloth before the elders of the town. This is very ancient practice. It's written about quite a bit in the ancient Jewish texts and other texts of the ancient Near East. In fact, it's mentioned a number of times in the Talmud. And they're going to spread the cloth out and see if there's any blood on it. And typically, the marriage was consummated at the wedding ceremony, and there were witnesses that watched them go in and watched them come out, and somebody would, typically the parents, would collect the sheet, or it would be the men and the women that were the attendants to the bride and the groom, and then they would give it to the parents of the bride for the evidence. But typically this was the proof. And it says that they're going to spread it out, and if she's found to not be lying, if it's true that she actually was a virgin, then the man is fined and he has to marry her as long as he lives. He can never divorce her, which is not a great punishment, but at least it is a punishment for him lying. But listen to what happens if there's no blood on the sheet. If, however, the charge is true, that evidence of the young woman's virginity was not found, then they shall bring the young woman out to the entrance of her father's house, and the men of her town shall stone her to death, because she has committed a disgraceful act in Israel by prostituting herself in her father's house. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So here, if she's caught lying about her virginity, she gets executed via stoning. If he is lying about her virginity, then he gets to pay a fine and she has to be his bride forever. But there's an even more horrific part of this passage that people overlook, which is that the majority of women don't actually bleed the first time they have sex. Only about 42 to 45% of women bleed their first time. And we know that this was true also in the ancient world because the ancient Jewish rabbis wrote about it. In fact, in the Talmud, there's a story in which a woman didn't bleed, and this was such a common practice that they had to start inventing new ways to determine if somebody was a virgin before the wedding. Because they knew that this was a problematic test. And one woman was asked, why didn't you bleed on your wedding night? And she said, the stairs in my father's house were really high up and my virginity wore off, meaning the rubbing from climbing the high steps caused her hymen to rupture prematurely. And there's a number of instances in the Talmud that record what could cause premature hymen ruptures. So eventually, they figured out that this wasn't actually a good test. Now, they came up with other tests that were even more horrific than this, but the fact remains, for a long period of time, this was the only test that they had. And the God of the Bible literally didn't know female anatomy and said that we are going to execute women for not bleeding the first time they do the deed. And half of these women that were executed, at least half of them, were actually innocent because God doesn't care about justice, and he certainly doesn't know female biology. All right, now we're on to our next, and this one's a little more familiar to some of the listeners. This is the book of Job, and Job is often thought of like this kind of heroic thing. There's a guy who like withstood all these terrible things and yet he still praised the Lord. And that sounds really great and comforting because you're like, yeah, I experienced bad things, but I can still praise the Lord in the midst of my struggles. But that's not really what's happening in the book of Job. Job is being horrifically treated by God to merely win a bet with Satan. Listen to what it says. Job verse 6 in chapter 1. On the day that the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, the accuser, that's Satan in most of your translations, the accuser also came among them. The Lord said to the accuser, "Where have you come from?" The accuser answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to the accuser, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on all the earth, and blameless and upright, a man who fears God and turns away from evil." So God is the one who initiated this whole nonsense. God says, "Hey, Satan, have you considered accusing my man Job?" And then listen to this. Then the accuser answered the Lord and says, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." So now Satan's calling him out and saying, listen, he's only doing this because you've given him everything. You take all that stuff away and he won't do that. Now, before we read verse 12, keep in mind, God is all knowing. This discussion doesn't even have to happen. But in verse 12 says, the Lord said to the accuser, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So the accuser went out from the presence of the Lord. Now, this is a silly thing because theoretically, God is all knowing. He knows the outcome. And theoretically, Satan would know the outcome too. Satan has to know that God is all knowing. There's no way that Satan doesn't know this. So the story already starts on a faulty premise, which is that God doesn't appear to be all knowing and Satan doesn't realize that God is all knowing. But nevertheless, in order for God to win a bet with Satan, God is about to allow Satan to literally torture this human being. And it says in verse 13, one day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So already we've got the animals getting wiped out, and it's going to be by a band of marauders coming in, and they're killing the servants and all the animals. Now, keep in mind, the servants didn't do anything wrong here. The servants are real, actual human beings, and God said, slaughter them. Verse 16 says, while he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. So now we've got more animals and servants that are executed, this time by the fire of God from heaven. God sent fire from heaven to execute human beings to win a bet with Satan. Verse 17, while he was still speaking, another came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 columns, made a raid on the camels and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So now more servants, more animals dead by the edge of the sword. While he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. So God now has allowed the entire family and all the servants of Job to be brutally executed in the most horrific ways possible. And keep in mind, all of this was done to merely win a bet with Satan, a bet that both of them should have already known the outcome because they both know that God is all knowing. And you might be saying to yourself, well, yeah, it's okay because these people went to heaven. We don't know that. We have no idea what their eternal resting place is. And if it's okay that anybody can just be executed at random because they would go to heaven, or anybody can be executed at random because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, then that means God doesn't know what justice is. He thinks that people can be tortured and executed arbitrarily at random, no matter if you've committed one sin or a million sins, it doesn't matter. Justice is now arbitrary because God can just execute you by the sword or by fire any way he pleases just because he's all powerful. This is not how justice works. In justice, you get what you deserve. You reap the reward for your sins or for your good behavior. What you don't do is get completely executed and annihilated so that you could win a bet. That's not justice. Now, let's look at one more passage that you guys know, and then we'll finish on one that most people aren't aware of. So, this is Exodus 11, and this is the final plague of Egypt, where the firstborn of Egypt are all going to get wiped out. And you might be saying, yeah, I already know the details of the story, but I'm sure you do. But there's a couple things nestled in here that I think would be really good to bring to the surface. Let's start in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you away. Tell the people that every man is to ask his neighbor, and every woman is to ask her neighbor for objects of silver and gold. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, Moses himself was a man of great importance in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's officials, and in the sight of the people. Moses said, Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out through Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the female slave who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the livestock. There will be a loud cry throughout the whole land of Egypt, such as has never been or will ever be again. Not a dog shall growl at any of the Israelites, not at people, not at animals, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Now listen to what's happened here. God is saying, I'm going to execute the firstborn of everybody. Remember, this is happening because of what Pharaoh did. God is upset at Pharaoh. That's what's happening here. But what he's going to do is punish all of the people of Egypt by taking their firstborn, people who had nothing to do with this. And many of these firstborn would have been children. Of course, some of them would have been adults too. The firstborn just means the firstborn. The age is not given. So this is the thing. It never needed to happen. This is only happening so that God can display his wonders. Verse 9, he says, The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you in order that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all the wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of his land. And he explains elsewhere in Exodus that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart so that he can get through all of these plagues, so that he can display how awesome and mighty he is. And his awesome and mighty nature is to execute innocent people who had nothing to do with Pharaoh's wrong dealings. Pharaoh was the one who committed the sin here, not the little suckling babies that are about to be executed, and certainly not the animals in verse 7 that are going to be executed. That's ludicrous. There's no reason why any of the animals have to be executed, let alone the fact that almost all the animals have already been executed in all the other plagues. There really shouldn't be any animals left. It's crazy that there's any animals left to be executed because they've already died 3 times. But that being said, this is not justice. What you cannot do is indiscriminately execute people within the kingdom because the king or the Pharaoh acted in a manner that you didn't like, especially when you were the one causing him to do it. The word that we get for hardening Pharaoh's heart shows up in the Hebrew causative stem. God is saying, I'm causing his heart to be hardened, which means God could have caused his heart to be softened. There doesn't need to be any plagues. Not a single plague ever needed to touch Egypt. God could have softened Pharaoh's heart and allowed Pharaoh to just let the people go. He could have done that because he did predispose the people to be favorable to the Egyptians. That's in verse 3. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. So he softened the Egyptians' hearts, but he hardened Pharaoh's heart, which means none of the plagues had to happen. God could have just let them go. In fact, he didn't have to touch anybody's heart to begin with. He didn't have to inflict on anybody's free will. He could have clicked his fingers and magically poofed all of the people out of Egypt into the land where he needed them. He didn't have to do any of these goofy displays of plagues and power, and executing poor, innocent little children, especially not the children of slave girls at the hand mill. It's absolutely horrific. Now, our last example of God being a barbarian who knows absolutely no justice is in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and it also continues in 1 Samuel 21 and a little bit in 1 Kings chapter 2. And this is an instance that needs a little bit of describing before we read it because there's a lot happening. But essentially, the priest Eli has two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they're scoundrels, and they're kind of desecrating the offerings and sacrifices, and they're sleeping with women at the shrine, the attendants, and they're basically just acting like hooligans. And Eli fails to rein them in. This is upsetting to God. God is mad that Eli is allowing all this to happen after he selected, the house of Eli to be his priests. So he basically condemns the entire household and said, no more. He sends a prophet, and the prophet gives judgment. And that's going to be in 1 Samuel. We'll start in chapter 2, verse 30. Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your family and the family of your ancestors should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. For those who honor me, I will honor, and those who despise me shall be treated with contempt. So he's saying, no more, you're being cut off. And then when we get to verse 31, see, a time is coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your ancestors' family. No one in your family shall ever live to old age. The only one of whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep out his eyes and grieve his heart. All the members of your household shall die by the sword. In fact, a number of manuscripts say that they will die young by the sword. It says, the fate of your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be assigned to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who would do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. So God is saying, I'm done with you. I'm cutting off all your lineage. There's only going to be one survivor, and that survivor is going to live out the rest of his life weeping and grieving. And then we see that that actually comes true if we go to 1 Samuel 21. What we find in 1 Samuel 21 is a really interesting situation where King David is now on the run from King Saul. And while he's on the run, he needs sustenance for him and for his people, the servants, his military people that are with him, so that they can continue on their journey. So they come to Nob, and there's a shrine at Nob where Ahimelech, an ancestor of Eli, a couple generations later, an ancestor of Eli, is serving as high priest. And there's a bunch of priests now serving in Nob at this time period. And the priest gives bread to David and water and bread to the men. And then he gives the sword of Goliath actually to David so that he can have a sword. And then he actually does an inquiry of Yahweh for him. So typically this refers to asking questions of God and casting the lots to see what God's response is. And he's doing all this, helping David, not realizing that David's actually on the run from King Saul. He has no idea that there's a feud going on between King Saul and King David. David showed up with a bunch of men, and he's doing everything he can to help David out. Not that big of a deal. But the problem is, after we leave chapter 21 and David's back on the run, we discover in chapter 22 that there was actually a snitch. There was a snitch that was at the place in Nob that saw everything go down, and he went back and told King Saul about what he witnessed. And now King Saul is very upset with all the priests at Nob, the household of Eli. And King Saul is about to do something quite in keeping for King Saul, if you've read much about him. After the king asks Ahimelech, why did you do all this? Why did you help out my enemy? Verse 14, Ahimelech answered the king, who among all of your servants is so faithful as David? He is the king's son-in-law and is quick to do your bidding and is honored in your house. So Ahimelech's defending himself here now. He's saying, listen, this is your son-in-law. He's a member of your household. I was doing what I thought was right. I wasn't trying to aid your enemy. Verse 15, it says, is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? By no means. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any member of my father's house, for your servant has known nothing of all of this, much or little. So Ahimelech, rightly so, is saying, I did not know I was doing anything wrong here. I have no idea. But King Saul is not appeased. In verse 16, the king says, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all of your father's house. The king said to the guard who stood around him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David. They knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me, but the servants of the king would not raise a hand to attack the priests of the Lord." So this is really interesting. The servants of King Saul are like, We're not going to execute the servants of the Lord. That's madness. That sounds like we're going to bring a curse on ourselves." So Saul says to his main man in verse 18, the king said to Doeg, "You, Doeg, turn and attack the priests." Doeg the Edomite turned and attacked the priests on that day and killed 85 who wore the linen ephod. Nob, the city of priests, he put to the sword, men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkey, and sheep he put to the sword. So he killed every single one of the members of that household exactly like it was prophesied in chapter 2. And then what happens? Only one person escaped. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And then we find in Second Kings that this escape of Abiathar the high priest is the final part of the fulfillment of what was actually prophesied to happen. Because we read later about Abiathar in 1 Kings chapter 2. Now that David is gone and Solomon is king, Solomon's giving new instructions to Abiathar because he's the only living descendant of that household. The king said to the priest Abiathar, "Go to Anathoth to your estate, for you deserve death, but I will not at this time put you to death, because you carried the ark of the Lord before my father David, and because you shared in all the hardships my father endured." So Solomon banished Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. So we got the bookend finally on the other end of that. First Kings chapter 2 says that the last remaining descendant, Abiathar, was banished in shame by Solomon, which means everything that was prophesied in 1 Samuel chapter 2 came true. Not a single person in the house of Eli lived into old age. They all died by the sword in their youth, men, women, children, even the animals. And then only one of them escaped, and he lived out the rest of his life in grief and weeping, exactly as it was predicted, because the God of this book is not a God of justice. The God of this book is a God of bloodshed and vengeance. And now, if you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching the whole thing. And please remember to like and subscribe. And a lot of these passages that I'm talking about show up on my deconstruction cheat sheet. If you are a subscribing member at the elite tier, if you click the join button, you'll have access to my deconstruction cheat sheet. You'll get a link to it. I update it almost daily with new information, and it is the best tool for deconstructing both with yourself and with others. And so I would highly recommend that. And also remember, we have a Discord community. If you go to my link tree in my profile, you can join our Discord community, and you can talk about any passage you want to in our Discord community. It's not a debate space, it's just a dialogue and community space, and we would love to see you there.